The cold was more than a bite. It was a constant gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The air in Siberia felt alive, like it could slip beneath your skin and freeze your thoughts in place. We had been out here for weeks, drilling through the permafrost, chasing rumors of treasure buried deep beneath the ice. No one had expected to find the giants. The first one, we thought it was a rock formation, something carved by time and wind. It was massive, easily twice the height of a man, its face half buried in the snow, features weathered but unmistakably human, or at least something like human. Thick, jagged lines cut across its stone skin, giving it a look of suffering or rage. One of the men, a big guy with a pickaxe, swung at it. He hit the thing's shoulder and we all heard it. A hollow ring, like metal striking bone. But no dust fell. No pieces chipped off. It was solid, impenetrable. "Probably some old myth or legend," the foreman muttered, waving us off. "Get back to work. We're here for the minerals, not some ancient statue." But no one could ignore it. Not really. It loomed over us like a nightmare, its expression too close to lifelike for comfort. Every time I looked at it, I could swear its eyes were watching us, tracking our movements. 3 days later, we found the second one. This time, its entire body was exposed, frozen in what looked like a mid-stride, arms outstretched. The same dead, lifeless expression carved into its face. But there was something different about this one. Its mouth was open. A scream locked forever in stone. That's when the tremors started. It was subtle at first, just a soft rumble beneath our feet. We assumed it was normal, that the earth was shifting as we dug deeper. But then the ground split, a jagged crack shooting out from beneath the giant's feet, stretching across the frozen terrain like a vein in diseased flesh. The crack led to something else, something worse. "Another one!" someone yelled. But this time the tone wasn't excitement. It was fear. Because this third giant, the one lying in the chasm, was moving. I saw it first. A twitch in its fingers, so slight I thought it was my imagination. But then the fingers curled, slowly, deliberately. Stone scraping against stone, an unholy sound that made my stomach twist. One of the miners screamed as the giant's head turned toward us. Its eyes, once cloudy and dead, now gleamed with a cold, unnatural light. "We need to go," I whispered, though the words barely formed on my lips. My breath froze in the air, hanging like the specter of death itself. But no one moved. We were trapped, rooted to the ground by some ancient terror that we couldn't explain. The giant pulled itself from the chasm with a groan that seemed to echo through the earth itself, limbs stiff from millennia of being buried. Its skin, or whatever it was, cracked and flaked, revealing something red and pulsing beneath. Not flesh, not blood, something older, something worse. I don't remember who ran first. I only remember the chaos that followed, the sound of footsteps pounding on the ice, the desperate, panicked breaths as men scrambled to escape what they didn't understand. One by one they fell, dragged into the widening crevasse by unseen hands. Not hands of the giants, no. Something else was down there in the darkness, something that slithered and whispered our names. The giant's movements were slow, deliberate, as if it knew we could never outrun it. It didn't need to rush. One of the men screamed, and I turned just in time to see him lifted into the air, impaled on the jagged remains of the second giant's arm. His body hung there, twitching, blood spilling in crimson rivulets down the stone. His eyes locked with mine, wide and pleading, but there was nothing I could do. The earth shook again, harder this time. The first giant, the one we had struck with a pickaxe, was cracking open, pieces of it falling away to reveal something wet and glistening beneath. The stone wasn't stone at all. It was a shell, a prison, and they were waking up. I ran. I don't know how far, how long. Time lost all meaning in that frozen hell. All I knew was that the tremors were getting worse, and behind me, the sound of something large, something ancient, was following. Slow, relentless. The sun was setting when I stumbled back into camp. I collapsed near one of the tents, panting, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then I heard it. A whisper, soft as the wind but clear as a scream. My name. It came from the ground beneath me. The crack in the earth was spreading, widening, reaching out like fingers from some unseen hand below. And then I realized those weren't statues. They weren't just giants. They were hunting us. And they were coming. I couldn't sleep that night. The tremors had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence you find in the still hours before dawn. No, this was a silence that hummed with a presence. like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting. I was back in the tent trying to calm myself, trying to shake the image of those dead stone eyes out of my mind. But I couldn't. The way they looked right at me, like they knew me, like they were inside my head, probing, searching for something. I felt dirty, like I'd been touched by something I couldn't scrub away. A sound outside made me jump. At first, it was just the faint shuffle of footsteps, the kind you'd expect from someone too tired to pick up their feet. But then it stopped, too suddenly. Too deliberately. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. Every instinct told me to stay inside the tent, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I couldn't. My curiosity pulled me, dragged me out into the night against my will. Outside, the air was frigid, biting at my skin. My breath puffed out in clouds, hanging in the stillness like smoke. The camp was deathly quiet. No one moved. No voices, no sounds. Just that awful, waiting silence. I walked toward the source of the sound, my boots crunching on the frozen ground. My hands shook, but not from the cold. Something was wrong. It was too quiet, too still. That's when I saw him. One of the men, Jacobson, I think his name was, stood by the edge of the crack in the earth. His back was to me, his body unnaturally stiff. His hands hung limply at his sides, palms up, like he was offering himself to whatever was down there. I called his name, my voice coming out weak, hollow. No response. He didn't move. Just stood there, staring into the abyss. I took a step closer, the cold creeping up my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with a sudden awareness that something was watching. Something was waiting. I didn't want to get any closer, but I had to know. I had to see. "Hey!" I called again, louder this time. My voice echoed off the ice and disappeared into the blackness. No answer. I was only a few feet away now, close enough to see his breath, slow and shallow, puffing out in lazy clouds. Close enough to notice something wet and dark dripping from his nose. Blood. I reached out, hesitated. Every part of me was screaming not to touch him, not to get any closer. But I did. My hand landed on his shoulder, and he turned slowly, almost mechanically, like he didn't hear me, like he was being pulled by some unseen force. His eyes, God, his eyes were wide and glassy, reflecting nothing but the empty void behind him. Blood trickled from his nose, his ears, and the corners of his mouth. His lips moved, whispering something I couldn't hear, something that made my stomach lurch. And then, before I could stop him, he stepped forward. I watched in horror as his body tilted, tipped, and fell into the crack. He didn't scream. He didn't make a sound. He just vanished into the dark, swallowed whole by the earth, as if he'd never existed. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, my mind numb with shock. I should have run. I should have yelled for help. But I didn't. I just stood there, staring into the void where he'd disappeared, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard it. A low rumble, deep and guttural, vibrating through the ground, through my bones. It was coming from the crack, growing louder, more insistent. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest as the ground beneath me began to tremble again. But this wasn't an earthquake. This was something else, something alive. I turned to run, but the ground exploded beneath me, sending me sprawling into the snow. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps, as I watched in horror as another giant pulled itself free from the earth, its massive hands clawing at the ice, its stone face twisted into a grotesque snarl. But this one was different. Its eyes weren't the cold, lifeless stones of the others. They glowed with a sickly, unnatural light, flickering with a malevolent intelligence. It looked right at me, its mouth pulling into a slow, deliberate grin. And then it spoke. The words weren't words at all. They were sounds, inhuman, guttural, like the earth itself was speaking through it. But I understood. Somewhere deep inside me, I understood what it was saying. It had been waiting for us, and now it was awake. I ran. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from that thing, that monster, that ancient horror crawling out of the earth. But even as I ran, I could feel its eyes on me, watching, following. I didn't get far. My feet slipped on the ice, sending me crashing to the ground. Pain shot through my leg, but I didn't care. I scrambled up, breathless, terrified, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. And that's when I saw them, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all pulling themselves free from the ice, their stone faces twisted in rage, their bodies cracking open to reveal the red, pulsing horrors beneath. The giants weren't statues. They were something far worse, and they were coming for us. A scream tore through the night, piercing and inhuman. It echoed off the ice, bouncing through the camp, growing louder, more frantic. But it wasn't one of the miners. It was something else. I wish I could tell you I was brave. I wish I could say I faced them head on, like some hero out of a myth. But the truth? I ran. I ran harder and faster than I've ever run in my life. My body was on fire, my lungs searing with each breath, but none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was getting away, putting as much distance between myself and them as I could. Behind me, the camp was in chaos. Screams echoed through the frigid air, desperate and terrified. Men were shouting orders, but it was no use. Panic had set in, and when panic takes hold, no one listens. All I could hear was the sound of those massive bodies moving, stone and ice grinding together in a sickening cacophony that made my bones rattle. As I ran, I glanced back just for a moment. I shouldn't have. The camp, or what was left of it, was being torn apart. One of the giants had ripped through the supply tent, tossing crates and debris like they were nothing. Another was pulling a miner up by his leg, shaking him like a rag doll before slamming him into the ground with a sickening thud. His body crumpled, limp and broken, like all the life had been drained out of him in an instant. Blood splattered across the snow in a bright, horrific spray. I turned away, bile rising in my throat. Keep running. Just keep running. The giants, no, not giants. I didn't know what to call them anymore, but they weren't what we thought. They weren't frozen, ancient relics from some long-forgotten age. They were alive. They had always been alive, trapped beneath the ice, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And we stupid, greedy men, we had set them free. I stumbled through the snow, my legs burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The world was a blur of white and black, the darkness closing in as the temperature plummeted. But I couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until I was sure I was safe, if there was such a thing as safety anymore. A sound stopped me in my tracks. It was faint, barely audible over the wind and the distant screams. A low, rhythmic thudding like footsteps, but these footsteps weren't coming from the giants behind me. No, these were closer. Much closer. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. The snow stretched out before me, untouched and pure, shimmering in the pale light of the moon. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it. The footsteps, the sound, maybe it was just the wind, playing tricks on my mind. But then I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the tree line. It was too far away to make out any details, just a silhouette against the snow. But something about it was wrong. Its stance, too rigid, too still. And then, as if sensing my gaze, the figure began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped forward, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. I backed up, my breath catching in my throat. No, it couldn't be. There was no way anyone had survived back there. No way anyone could have outrun those things. But as the figure drew closer, I could see it. Clothes torn and bloodied, eyes wide and staring, unblinking. It was one of the miners. The same one I had seen fall into the crevasse. But he was dead. I had seen him die. His body, broken and limp, swallowed by the earth. There was no coming back from that. And yet here he was, walking toward me. I took another step back, the cold biting at my skin. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was I seeing things? Was the cold driving me mad? The miner kept coming, his footsteps heavy, unnatural. As he moved closer, I could see the gash in his head, the jagged wound where someone had struck him. Blood oozed down his face, freezing in thick rivulets, but his expression remained blank, devoid of pain, devoid of life. I turned to run, but before I could take a step, another figure appeared, blocking my path. This one was worse. His face was wrong, twisted, like it had been stretched, pulled too tight across his skull. His mouth hung open in a grotesque grin, blood and something darker dripping from his teeth. My heart pounded in my chest. I was surrounded. They weren't alive. I knew that much. But they weren't dead either. Something had brought them back, something that lived deep within the ice, within the earth. And it was using them. Puppets, animated by whatever ancient force we had disturbed. Behind me, the ground rumbled again, and I could hear it. More footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward me. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted, crashing through the trees, branches whipping at my face, my legs screaming in protest with every step. But I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when I could feel them closing in, their dead eyes watching, following, waiting for me to trip, to fall, to give up. My foot caught on something. A root, a rock I didn't know. And I went sprawling, face first, into the snow. Pain shot through my arm, but I forced myself up, blinking away the tears of frustration. I had to keep moving. But when I looked up, I saw them. Dozens of them, standing in a circle around me, their faces frozen in twisted, grotesque grins. Some of them were missing limbs. Others had gaping wounds that oozed black ichor, but none of that mattered. They were all staring at me, waiting. And then I saw it. Behind them, emerging from the trees, was the giant. The one with the glowing eyes. Its massive form loomed over the dead men, casting a long, dark shadow across the snow. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't understand, but I felt them, deep in my bones, in my mind. It was calling to me. And I knew in that moment that running wouldn't save me. It had never been about survival. I was already dead. I stood there, watching the black veins snake across my skin, feeling the ice-cold dread settle deep in my bones. It was over, wasn't it? There was no escape from this. I could feel the giant's presence inside me, their ancient, malevolent will twisting my thoughts, creeping into every corner of my mind. I was being consumed. But then something unexpected happened. A warmth, faint at first, began to spread from somewhere deep within me. It pushed against the cold, fighting it, resisting it. I could feel it, this strange heat growing stronger, burning away the dark tendrils as they moved beneath my skin. My heartbeat quickened, not out of fear this time, but out of something else. Hope. The warmth spread, like a flame reigniting after being nearly extinguished. I felt it rise through my chest, flooding my limbs with a strength I didn't know I had. The giant's voices, the ones that had been whispering inside my head, drowning out my thoughts, began to fade, their words becoming disjointed, broken. The giants shifted, their glowing eyes flickering in confusion. They could feel it too, this change, this power they hadn't expected. They weren't in control anymore. Something inside me was fighting back. And then it hit me, I was fighting back. I don't know where the strength came from, or why it had waited until now to show itself, but it was there, burning inside me. Something deep in my soul refused to let the darkness win. The more I focused on that warmth, the stronger it grew, until it wasn't just a faint flicker, it was a fire, raging, consuming everything in its path. The black veins that had been crawling across my arms shriveled and burned away, leaving my skin clear and clean. The oppressive weight of the giant's presence. The oppressive weight of the giant's presence lifted, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt like myself again. The giants, those towering ancient monsters, took a step back. Their glowing eyes, once filled with dark purpose, now flickered with something unexpected. Fear. They had never anticipated resistance. They had been asleep for so long, trapped beneath the ice, and now here I was, standing before them, not as their victim, but as something more. I didn't fully understand it, but I could feel the power coursing through me. The warmth inside wasn't just burning away the darkness, it was pushing it out, driving it back. I stepped forward, raising my hand toward the nearest giant. The heat inside me surged, coursing through my veins like molten fire. I could feel it radiating out, reaching for the giants, forcing them back. With a crack that reverberated through the ground, the first giant fell. Its massive body shattered, crumbling into pieces of stone and dust. The others, still standing, glanced around in disbelief. Their glowing eyes dimmed as if the life within them was being drained. I took another step forward, and the fire inside me blazed even brighter. The second giant crumbled like the first, its stone skin cracking apart and breaking into fragments. It hit the ground with a deafening thud, sending tremors through the ice beneath my feet. One by one, the remaining giants followed. Their stone bodies shattered and disintegrated into the snow, their ancient, oppressive presence fading with each step I took. They weren't just defeated, they were gone, reduced to nothing more than rubble scattered across the frozen wasteland. I stood there panting, my breath coming out in short, white bursts against the frigid air. The warmth inside me began to cool, its job done, but it left behind a strange sense of peace. The darkness that had been crawling inside me, the black veins that had tried to consume me, were gone. I was free. The camp, or what remained of it, was eerily silent. No more screams. No more tremors. The giants were gone, and the terror that had gripped this place had lifted. I looked around, feeling disoriented, trying to make sense of the destruction. And then, through the pale light of the rising sun, I saw them. Survivors. Men, some bruised, some battered but alive, were emerging from the trees. They had hidden when the giants had risen, too afraid to fight, too smart to confront what they couldn't understand. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with shock and relief, but they were alive. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't afraid. I had faced the impossible. I had stared into the face of an ancient evil, and somehow, I had survived. One of the men, the foreman who had once been so certain we were here only for minerals and profit, stumbled toward me. His clothes were torn, his face bruised, but he was alive. He looked at me with wide eyes filled with awe and disbelief. What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling with the weight of everything he had just witnessed. I didn't know how to explain it. How could I? But I smiled. A real, genuine smile for the first time since this nightmare had started. "We won," I said, though I wasn't sure how much truth there was in those words. "We're going home." And we did. We left the frozen wasteland behind, the shattered remains of the giants buried beneath the snow. Whatever force had awakened them, whatever ancient power had stirred beneath the ice, was gone. The warmth inside me, the fire that had saved me, remained, a quiet reminder of the battle we had fought and won. As the helicopter lifted us away from the frozen tundra, I looked down at the white expanse stretching out below. The land was still, peaceful, as if the giants had never existed at all. But I knew the truth. They had been real. They had been a threat. And somehow, by some miracle, we had survived. But as I looked down, I also realized something else. The warmth inside me had not left entirely. It was still there, faint but steady, as if waiting for the next time it would be needed. Maybe it wasn't just me who had won that battle. Maybe something far greater had taken an interest in us, something older, something watching. But whatever it was, for now we were safe. The giants were gone. The darkness had been beaten back, and we were going home.